Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is what I call my morning musings here on Now TV. I just want to thank you so very, very much for being with me. We are continuing our study of the absolutely critical word, kairos, as it's developed in the New Testament. By the way, in the not too distant future, if nothing else happens, I will be publishing a major book entitled Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, an examination of the relationship between Israel's final feast day, Sukkot, and the resurrection of the dead. Now, in that book, I have an extensive investigation of the significance of the word kairos. What does the word kairos mean? It means the divinely appointed time. Well, what does that have to do with everything else about eschatology? It has everything in the world to do with it. Because the Old Testament set the time for the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection. That time is found in Daniel chapter 9, found in Daniel 2, found in Daniel 7, found in Daniel 12. F.F. Bruce made the comment that no other book, no other prophecy in the entirety of the Old Testament so clearly attempts to set a time for the coming of the kingdom than does the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 2 sets the time for the coming of the kingdom as the days of the Roman Empire. Daniel chapter 7 posits the coming of the kingdom, the judgment, the resurrection, again, the coming of the Lord, the days of the Roman Empire. Daniel chapter 9, when properly understood, and I wrote a book on this some years ago, entitled 70 Weeks Are Determined for the Resurrection. You can find that book on my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Now, if you go there and if you order that book, and if you mention that you saw this offer on Now TV or even YouTube, I will refund your shipping. That's going to save you almost $5. Okay? That's a fantastic price because the book itself is inexpensive. And by the way, let me make this observation. Here we are in June, and we've been notified by my publisher, the printer, that printing costs are going up this month. June the 20th of 2023, the cost of producing the books is going up. So you want to take advantage of the current pricing while it's still available. So once again, go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. I cannot make this offer after June of 2023. Every once in a while, and this is no disrespect of any kind, but every once in a while, I'll get someone who contacts me and they've watched a video from 2 or 3 years ago, in which I made a special offer, a discounted offer. And they say, hey, will you still give me that offer? Well, that's a little bit tough, but normally I give it. I cannot do that on any orders after June of 2023. All right? Just keep that in mind. So, June 2023 is the time to make your book orders, to save yourself some money, because we are forced, unfortunately, because media mail has already gone up. Our cost to ship off, for instance, in May, I made a 2-book special, all right? We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, and The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. Well, the normal cost of those 2 books, if you ordered them separately, would have been, $57.95. But for the month of May 2023, I offered those 2 books, total delivered price, $39.95. Now remember, that's not available anymore. All right? The cost of those 2 books have them printed is going up substantially. We will keep our cost as low as possible, believe you me. But just to ship these 2 books is now costing us a good bit more than it normally has. So once again, after June 2023, we cannot honor the prices that we have been offering. Just cannot do it. We'd be losing money. Okay. In my book, 70 Weeks Are Determined for the Resurrection, I take note of the fact that the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9, 24 and following actually involve the resurrection of the dead. Now, I understand the word resurrection is not there. That's not the point. So, when we understand that Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27 foretold the resurrection, therefore it foretold the new creation. After all, it did predict the time of the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Well, folks, that's the new heaven and new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3. That's the new heaven and new earth of Revelation 21 and 22. So when we determine when the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9 was to be, we can determine the time of the resurrection. So we've been spending a good bit of time over the last several weeks sharing with you our understanding, my understanding of the terms, the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9. Because those constituent elements, once again, point us to the eschatological consummation, and, to be brief, they point us specifically to AD 70. Now, all sorts of attempts are made to avoid this reality. We are told by the dispensationalists, well, yeah, you know, Jesus came to establish the kingdom. The Jews rejected him, therefore the kingdom was postponed. No, the kingdom was not postponed. God did not withdraw the kingdom offer. He kept his word right on time. Other attempts to escape the force of Daniel chapter 9 are, and it's what we want to discuss this morning, okay? We are told that the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9 ended in approximately 34-35 with the stoning of Stephen. And thus, that must mean Daniel 9 in its entirety, 70 weeks are determined, was fulfilled no later than 34 or 35 AD. Now, that brings us back to focus on the constituent element of Daniel 9 that we have been focused on for the last several weeks. 70 weeks are determined to finish the transgression. Many scholars, both rabbis and Christian scholars alike, agree that this term, to finish transgression, has reference to the idea that by the end of the 70th week, Israel would fill up the measure of her sin, resulting in the destruction of Jerusalem, God's judgment on her for fulfilling or filling up the measure of her sin. Now, this whole concept, as I've been sharing with you, this whole concept of filling up the measure of sin, it was foretold in the Old Testament that it would take place in the New, that is to say, in the first century. Pardon me. We find that in Isaiah chapter 65 and 6. In predicting the events of the first century, and I know that they were events of the first century because Paul quotes verbatim from Isaiah 65, 1 and 2 in Romans 10, 22, verbatim, and applies it to his generation. So in Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 6, the Lord says, I'm going to measure your sins and the sins of your fathers into your bosom. As many Hebrew scholars have said, what we find here is the concept, the motif, the subject of the filling up of the measure of sin. Okay, since Paul applied Isaiah 65 to his generation, and since God was predicting that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin, then that means that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin in the first century. The great question becomes, by what means or at what point would Israel fill up the measure of their sin? Well, most people, or at least I should say, many people would say Israel filled up the measure of their sin when they killed Jesus. Well, certainly absolutely nothing could be worse than that. Killing the Son of God. When Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost, he pointed the finger, he along with the other apostles, pointed the finger at that multitude and says, him, that is Jesus, being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, you have taken, and by wicked hands you have crucified and slain. Well, that's what you call a blunt sermon, isn't it? Peter didn't point to anything else. Now, does that mean that nothing else played a part in the filling up of the measure of sin? No, because Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, standing in the temple, the very place where Peter was preaching in Acts chapter 2, there in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus accused the Jews of being guilty of killing or of shedding all of the blood of all of the righteous. And he said to them, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Behold, I send to you apostles, prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you shall crucify and scourge and chase from city to city, that upon you may come all of the blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. So Jesus, notice, Jesus didn't even mention his own death as part of the filling up of the measure of sin. Now, does that mean that he wasn't including that? Obviously not. How do I know that? Well, just prior to that, just a few months prior, well, perhaps just a couple of weeks maybe, in Matthew chapter 21, he told the parable of the vineyard. A certain nobleman had a great vineyard, and he let it out to husbandmen. When the time of the vintage harvest came, he sent out his servants to gather the harvest. Those wicked men took those servants and beat them, mistreated them. He sent more. Same thing happened. Finally, he said, well, I will send my son to them. Surely they will honor him. Instead, they reasoned among themselves, and they said, see, here is the son. Let us kill him and take the inheritance for ourselves. Evidently, they thought they would avoid punishment, which was a rather idiotic thing to say. But the master of that vineyard sent out his armies, and he destroyed those wicked men. And Jesus turned, this is so ironic, and it's really humorous. Jesus said, and he turned to the Jews, Pharisees specifically, Sadducees, scribes, and lawyers, what will that master do to those wicked husbandmen? And they responded and said, he will come and utterly destroy them. Notice that Jesus ties the coming of the Lord with the destruction of those who killed the Son. Coming of the Master. Now, what's my point? The point, of course, is that even though Matthew chapter 23, Jesus did not include himself in the measure of suffering to fill up the measure of sin, he certainly did include himself in Matthew chapter 21. This is why we have to take a holistic approach to the scriptures. Okay? pardon me, we cannot take Matthew chapter 23 and say, oh, well, the killing of Jesus didn't participate or contribute, I should say, to the filling up of the measure of sin. That's ridiculous, because Matthew chapter 21 has it filling up the measure of sin. Matthew chapter 22 has the filling up of the measure of sin to do with those who were invited to the wedding. They mistreated the servants sent to them. They killed those servants sent to them. And the master of the wedding was angry, sent out his armies, and he destroyed those wicked men and burnt their city. Okay, once again, the Son is not even mentioned as suffering there. But we cannot exclude that. You see, folks, we cannot afford to have what I call an atomistic perspective of hermeneutic, of interpretation. We have to take the holistic perspective, take this part with this part, with this part and this part. We have to take everything that is said about a given subject. We conflate it all, we assimilate it all, and based upon the totality of the evidence, we draw our conclusion. So, when attempts are made to say, oh, well, Israel filled up the measure of their sin by killing Jesus, putting him on the cross, that's not the story. That is to say, that's not the whole story. The whole story includes the killing of the prophets in the past, Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following. It includes the crucifixion of Jesus, but it also includes the apostles and the prophets, the scribes, that Jesus was going to send to Israel, and Israel would kill them. The persecution didn't stop with Jesus. The filling up of the measure of sin by persecuting Jesus' servants did not end with Jesus' death. Because once again, I've got to reiterate this because this is so critically important. The filling up of the measure of sin did not happen with the past fulfillment of the prophets. That's clear in Matthew 23. It did not end with the death of Jesus. That's clear from Matthew 22, 21 and 22. It also involved the killing of Jesus' apostles and prophets. Notice the plural in Matthew 23. Behold, I send to you prophets, scribes, and wise men. And Luke chapter 11 and Luke chapter 13, 28 to 33, we have apostles included. Another good example where you can't take one passage and set it over another. In Matthew 23, Jesus doesn't mention apostles, but in Luke chapter 11, he does. Are we supposed to assume that these are two different persecutions at two different times? No, that's ridiculous. Have to excuse me for my bluntness, but some people practice this atomistic hermeneutic and they try to dichotomize between this verse and that verse because this verse doesn't mention a word, term, or phrase that this one doesn't use. And by the way, some people use the same misguided hermeneutic because they say, oh, well, Preston, you use words, terms, and phrases that are not found in the Bible. And we can't use words, terms, or phrases that are not found in the Bible. That's utterly ridiculous. If we are using words, terms, and phrases that are properly, truthfully descriptive of the truths being set forth in the Bible, we are not violating any kind of hermeneutical principle. Once again, it's just, it's utterly ridiculous. Now, let me go on. The question, therefore, once again is, when would the filling up of the measure of sin be completed? Now, remember, folks, we're talking about the appointed time. The appointed time of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel chapter 12. The appointed time for what? Well, according to John, in the book of Revelation, I should say, according to the Father who knew the day and the hour, the Father who knew the day that he had appointed in which he was going to judge the world in righteousness. Acts chapter 17, 30 and 31. It is that appointed time, that kairos, that the Father revealed to Jesus to show to the churches the things which must shortly, intakai, meaning very, very soon, because the time, the kairos, has arrived. The appointed time for the fulfillment of the book of Revelation had arrived when John wrote. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute abuse of hermeneutic to say, well, yeah, John was told those things were shortly to come to pass when he wrote 2,000 years ago, and we're still waiting on them. Because the appointed time is our generation. No, absolutely, teetotally not. But let me continue. So we are told, well, the 70 weeks were determined at the cross, filled up at the cross. Sorry, that's not true. We've already seen that. So then we are told, well, okay, they must have been fulfilled at the time of the stoning of Stephen. Well, let's revert back, or let's look at one of the other constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9. One of the constituent elements was 70 weeks are determined to seal, vision, and prophecy. What does that mean? To seal vision and prophecy means to bring the prophetic office to its completion and finalization and termination through the fulfillment of all prophecy. Well, I wrote a book on this some years ago entitled Seal It, Vision, and Prophecy. And listen to me. It is absolutely amazing that across the entire spectrum of evangelical Christianity, it really doesn't matter whether it's premillennialist, amillennialist, or postmillennialist. There is almost a universal consensus that terminology, seal, vision, and prophecy, meant the completion of the prophetic office, the cessation of the prophetic office, through the fulfillment of all prophecy. Well, it makes perfect sense, because after all, as we've already pointed out, in Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks were determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. The bringing in of everlasting righteousness is the new heaven and new earth. It's the time of the resurrection. Everyone agrees the time of the resurrection is when all things would be fulfilled. And since all things would be fulfilled, there's no more prophetic office. You see how that works? So the question, therefore, is, were the 70 weeks fulfilled at the time of the stoning of Stephen in 34-35 AD? No. Well, how do I know that? Because all prophecy was not fulfilled in 34-35 AD. So in order to get the filling up the measure of sin fulfilled in 34-35 AD, you have to have prophecy fulfilled. Maybe not all of it, but you certainly have to have this key constituent element fulfilled. And furthermore, that filling up of the measure of sin would do what? It would bring in the judgment of Old Covenant Israel. Wait a minute, from 34-35 AD until 70 AD, that's 35 years. So some people try to say, well, here's what happened. Okay, the measure of sin was filled up 34-35 AD. But the punishment for filling up the measure of sin actually lay outside of the 70 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not what Daniel 9 says. 70 weeks are determined upon your holy people and upon your city to finish the transgression. 70 weeks are determined on your people and your city. The fate of the city lies within the 70 weeks, every bit as much as the filling up of the measure of sin. The fate of the city lies every bit as much within the 70 weeks as the putting away of sin. The fate of the people and the fate of the city lies every bit as much within the 70 weeks as 70 weeks are determined to make atonement. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's simply no way in this world to say that the 70 weeks were fulfilled in the persecution of Stephen. And how do I know that even further? Well, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 15 to 16, Paul spoke of how the Judeans had persecuted and killed the prophets. They have killed the Lord. And now, when Paul wrote in approximately 49 or 50 AD, writing 1 Thessalonians, he said they are killing us, the apostles and prophets of the Lord. Now, notice what Jesus said once again. I'm going to send you apostles, prophets, wise men. Some of them you will crucify, scourge, chase from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood of all the righteous, okay? So Jesus said that the killing of the apostles and prophets was involved in the filling up of the measure of sin. Well, look, Stephen, he was certainly a wise man. He was an inspired man. He was not an apostle or a prophet. But Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is talking about the filling up of the measure of sin by killing the apostles and prophets. I'm out of time. Totally. I will pick this up again next week. Thanks for joining me.